Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, the show where brilliant professionals share how to sharpen the universal skills required to flourish at work. Enjoy more career fun, wins, meaning, and money with your host, Pete Makaitis.
Hello, and thanks so much for joining us here for episode 261 with Heather and Alan Ackmann. We have got a husband-wife duo who are PowerPoint maestros. So we'll be going deep on their perspectives to make your experiences with this software so much better. So you'll learn 1, when, why, and how you should use PowerPoint and when you shouldn't. 2, the 3 fundamental factors to consider when designing your slides. And 3, when to use emotionally driven graphics. So if you'd like to check out the show notes, the transcript, or the links to items that we've referenced here, you'll find that on over at awesomeatyourjob.com/F261. And while you're at awesomeatyourjob.com, I encourage you to check out some of our helpful stuff. One thing I think is pretty helpful is just the magnifying glass right up there in the navigation bar. If you click it, you can search the fully transcribed text of 261 and counting conversations. So if there is an issue you are facing, take a look, see what you find there. And if you don't find anything, hey, let me know. Maybe we should get another episode on that very topic. Email pete@awesomeatyourjob.com. So we got dual intros here. Alan Ackmann is the Professional Writing for Business Coordinator in the Writing, Rhetoric, and Discourse Department at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. His teaching specialties include professional and technical writing and the rhetoric of slideware and presentations. He has led professional development seminars for teachers on the local, state, and national level. And in his spare time, he enjoys spending time with his wife, we'll hear from her, and 2 children, as well as jogging, reading, and singing. Now, Heather's story is that she is an author, Microsoft certified trainer, and Microsoft MVP. Since 2006, she's designed, authored, and narrated over 300 hours of video-based training for a variety of public and private entities. In 2016, she co-founded the AHA Learning Solutions, to provide high-quality learning materials to educational institutions and businesses nationally. She is an active member of the presentation community and a proud member of the Presentation Guild. You may find her sharing advice and Microsoft Office news on Twitter at Heather Ackmann. Big thanks to Heather and Alan for sharing their wisdom with us, and big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. And big thanks to our sponsor, Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for your future. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with just your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invests your money for you. NerdWallet.com, whom I love on these sorts of matters, gives Acorns a whopping 4.7 stars and says, quote, if you want to make the most of your spare change, there's no better place to do that than Acorns. Head to acorns.com/awesome or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. And we got a legal disclaimer here. It may not be representative of all clients. Tier 1 compensation provided. Compensation provides an incentive to positively promote Acorns. View important disclosures at acorns.com/awesome. Investing involves risk, including the loss of principal. Please consider your objectives, risk tolerance, and Acorns' fees before investing. Acorns Advisors LLC, Acorns, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Brokerage services are provided to clients of Acorns by Acorns Securities LLC, member FINRA/SIPC. For more information, visit acorns.com. One sponsor to check out is Harvard Business Review. This brilliant magazine, published at hbr.org, is the leading destination for smart management thinking. Fun fact, HBR has been mentioned in 108 episodes of the show. That's because HBR has great stuff that comes up often. They've got explainer videos, podcasts, real-world case studies, and much more. I think of HBR each night that I put on my special orange glasses. Their article, Will Blue Light Glasses Improve Your Sleep?, revealed that those who wore them reported better sleep and a 7% improvement in work performance as compared to those who wore the sham glasses. So I cite HBR anytime anyone tells me that I look silly wearing them. Now, much of HBR's content is available for free when you sign up at their site. Subscriptions that get you unlimited content cost $10 a month. If you visit hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME, you can save 10% off of that subscription. Again, to save 10% off of your HBR subscription, go to www.hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME. Here is Alan and Heather. Heather and Alan, thanks so much for joining us here on the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, so I'm so intrigued that both of you climb stairs competitively Tell us, how did that become a hobby of yours, and why do you keep doing it?
Well, competitively is probably not the word to describe me. I'm usually the last to finish. Alan's got a much better time than I do, and our son did it with us last year. He had a great time, but we got into it through one of the companies I used to work with. That was Train Signal. Well, yeah.
Train Signal.
Train Signal. It was a company, it recently bought out, not recently, but a few years ago, bought out by Pluralsight. That's the company now. But one of our colleagues, he was really involved with the Respiratory Health Association, and he would volunteer with them, and he would climb stairs, and he got our company involved, and our whole entire company, like, yeah, let's go climb stairs. And so that's what we did as a company. We all joined a team together and got family members involved, and that's how Alan got into it.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty big thing here in Chicago, A, because there's so many skyscrapers, and B, because the weather is so terrible for 6 months of the year. So you can have a lot of like 5K or 10K runs in the summertime.
It's beautiful.
But when it's like right now, I look out the window and it's nice and sunny, but it's also -4 degrees outside currently.
Right.
So that means that people have to find other ways to stay active. So there are climbs for the Hancock Building, the Willis Tower, the Aon Center, and a lot of the other iconic Chicago skyscrapers.
But the hustle up the Hancock, I personally believe, is the most fun to do. They usually put people in the stairwells with like the big foam fingers, and they'll high five you every like 4 floors or something and be like, oh yeah. And they put signs inside the stairwell to tell you how well you're doing. Like, you've climbed higher than the Eiffel Tower. And it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's right, Paris. Take that. We're way taller.
Yeah.
I did the hustle up the Hancock once at Bain, and I remember, you talk about competitively, I remember, I think, as compared to everybody in the hustle up the Hancock, I think I was just slightly above average. And then as compared, thank you. And then as compared to my Bain colleagues, I was like last or second to last. And it's like, this is how I kind of feel about my career.
It's kind of funny. Like, for a while when I was young doing it, it was a question of trying to beat my time from the previous year. And as I've gotten a little older, into the upper 30s, it's more like trying to not be significantly worse than my time from the previous year. So it's more like competing with previous performances.
Or, yourself, I just want to finish at this point after 2 kids. Yeah, I just want to finish and not pass out and have to be carried out on a stretcher. That's kind of my goal.
Well, and you're succeeding. So, kudos on those
I'm
accomplishments.
Here to talk about it. So I'm succeeding gloriously.
Well, you two are an interesting couple, not just for your stair climbing enthusiasm, but also because both of you study and teach on PowerPoint. And sometimes it happens together, or is it all kind of in your own unique context?
Well, in rare occasions, we do talk about it together, but most of the time we kind of pass projects off to each other. We have our own separate audiences that we train to. Alan deals more with an academic audience, students and other professors.
Yeah, students and professional development for teachers.
Yeah. And I deal more with professionals, people in business contexts, or more train the trainer situations for the professional context.
Okay, cool. Well, so now let's really, we could talk about PowerPoint for a long time, and maybe we'll need a follow-up interview to go into it. So can you tell us, broadly speaking, when is PowerPoint the ideal tool to use versus when should we use maybe another software tool or an entirely different approach to doing a presentation?
For me, I guess it starts not with the question of when to use PowerPoint, but why to use PowerPoint. I think that there's a lot of people who will sometimes go for PowerPoint as the default tool, where they use it either because it's something that they're expected to use as part of a presentation, for example. And so it's really easy to think about PowerPoint as something that you just kind of inherit. But if you're making your own choices, then PowerPoint is the best, I think, when you have an opportunity to use it in a way that'll benefit the viewer or listener's experience. Because when PowerPoint, I think, is used in an unproductive way, it becomes something that is used because it helps the speaker. It turns into something like a teleprompter. It becomes a way of taking the burden of explanation off of you as the presenter and kind of shunting it off towards the slides themselves. And in that case, it's not PowerPoint as something that's going to help a reader understand your main ideas or organize the logic behind what you have to say or create some kind of an emotional impact. It's just a way for an instructor to get through it. So one of the biggest challenges that I see is people kind of falling into that trap. So if you don't have a situation like that where it's good for a listener, then that by itself is kind of indicative of my being a bad choice.
Along the same lines, even in terms of our various audiences, there are certain people in both groups who shun PowerPoint or just slideware in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be PowerPoint. And the reasons that they shun them aren't necessarily surrounded about the when or even the why, but the tool itself, because it's been overused or because it has been abused. And those are also the wrong reasons to shun a particular tool. You need to look at, I would say, more along the lines of the context or why it's helping that particular presentation or that moment. So when looking at why you would use a tool such as PowerPoint, like how is it helping that presentation? PowerPoint is created as ideally a visual aid. Why would you need a visual? How is it helping the content of the presentation? How is it helping the speaker collect their ideas or tell that story? And those are the questions you should be asking in helping determine when and how you should be utilizing PowerPoint.
Okay, perfect. So I like that. So not just accepting it as the default, oh, this is the thing to do because it's there. Thinking about it not as a teleprompter and more a tool for the audience and not for the presenter. And thinking, okay, when would a visual really do the trick? So that's helpful to think about. I get slideware, which is such a fun word. I don't,
yeah.
It brings back to consulting days. It sounds so elegant, like glassware in a laboratory. Slideware. So then, let's talk about slideware. When would you say maybe Prezi or Keynote or something else might be a wiser choice than PowerPoint?
Oh, gosh. Prezi. I don't use Prezi that often. In fact, you're familiar with the conference, the Presentation Summit?
It's ringing a bell. I've never been.
Oh, you have to go. It's so much fun. It's where all of the great presentation designers and presenters, speakers, Dr. Carmen Simon, who I know has been on your show.
Oh, yeah.
She speaks there. She's a keynote speaker there, like almost every year. Everyone loves her. So the Presentation Guild is a kind of a nonprofit organization for presentation designers, people who design presentations, who speak in the industry, who work in the industry. It's an organization for them. And they go to the Presentation Summit and basically help fellow designers there. It's a place to go.
Cool.
So at this conference, someone offhandedly referred to Prezi as kind of a one-night stand. You use it once. And I think that was a bit harsh, but Prezi does have its place. And certainly companies do request Prezi presentations from time to time. And it does have kind of a unique look and feel. But I've also seen Prezi used, what I'd say poorly, where it's just basically sections that have been called out and with the title and the bullets underneath, and it's just zooming from one place to another. Another context where Prezi is not really appropriate is for webinars, where you just don't have the screen capture, the upload, the frame rate to really handle it. So there's not, again, you kind of have to think of the environment where you're presenting and whether or not it can handle it. I'm an online student at DePaul, and I've had some professors try to use Prezi, and just when you're watching back a lecture as an online student, you miss all of those animations. It's just not there. And so, yeah.
Okay, so that's the Prezi story. So now, Keynote is pretty similar to PowerPoint, although with its own flavor. So how might you speak to Keynote or some of the other slideware tools available?
Now, honestly, I really don't use Keynote. I know a lot of my PowerPoint MVP colleagues, they use Keynote a lot more than I do. I'm a PC girl. I stick to the PC.
Yeah, in terms of persona, I'm kind of the same way. Thinking back to the old marketing campaigns, I'm much more the dweeby PC guy.
Yeah.
The hipster Mac guy.
Yeah.
In the end. And my loyalties with PowerPoint kind of go the same way.
Yeah, they run pretty deep. So
I think it's interesting, though, with PowerPoint, if you look at it from kind of a market dominance point of view, it's difficult for me to answer a question about Keynote because it seems fundamentally to operate along kind of the same software logic that PowerPoint does. So a lot of the best practices for it are pretty similar. And so in that case, you're talking a little bit about maybe what tool would be optimal, but I don't think a lot of the underlying strategy would change very much, especially if you think about PowerPoint and Keynote as being about something, using it purposefully as opposed to kind of what technical advantages it can offer. Can I go back to Prezi for just a second? So I hear Prezi, and Prezi is a really interesting use case for me because it almost reminds me of some of the earlier versions of PowerPoint and how it was marketed. In the early versions of PowerPoint, when they were first debuting a lot of animations and transitions, and it was all about the new kind of gadgets and impacts that PowerPoint could have, going back a couple iterations back in the program. And I look at Prezi presentations, and a lot of it reminds me of like what you would see in PowerPoint presentations from like 10 years ago when animations were first becoming available, because it becomes, when used badly, it becomes less about, look at the message I have to say, and more about, look at what this cool tool can do. Mm-hmm. So when people get into Prezi and they get kind of enamored with the various transitions and swoops and zooms and all those things that can really add a neat, I've seen a lot of Prezis where they add a lot of neat aesthetic texture, but not a lot where it can
complements material.
Where it complements the material. The exception is when people are giving presentations that are kind of about dealing with the individual components of a larger thing. So if you've got a presentation, for example, about a departmental reorganization, and you want to start with like a global view and then zoom into the individual departments themselves and their components and purposes, that can do a really good job of maybe demonstrating how the individual things fit into the larger perspective, which can really, I think, serve a very persuasive purpose.
Okay, yeah. Or maybe from a sales presentation perspective, if, hey, here's this cool piece of hardware, and here's how it works with regard to some of the subcomponents. And
exactly.
So, okay, I'm with you.
I would love to see a Prezi that's almost in technical communication, kind of a exploded diagram of components and how the individual component of an engine works or something like that. Mm-hmm. Again, that's a purposeful use.
Yes.
Instead of just look at the thing that it can do.
Yeah. It's really hard for individuals who are not naturally like visually inclined to be able to take their material like on black and white paper and to translate it into something that is largely visual. It's easy for me to do, but it's not everyone's like that. And so it's just, when you have a tool like Prezi that's like this large open canvas where there really isn't a lot of suggestions, you just see this large open white piece of paper. And I think that kind of just stumps the user. And they just, what do? It's like opening up a white, like butcher paper almost. Like, what do I draw? It can be really intimidating. And so without a little bit, I think, of hand holding or examples to look at, I just think people just don't know how to visualize their own ideas in like a three-dimensional space, which ultimately that is Prezi.
And a lot of PowerPoint does through its use of smart art and those kinds of quasi-directed template-driven design is to kind of give the user that direction that you were just expressing.
At least some kind of ideas with what to do with it, even though that they're not always perfect and they're not always necessarily helpful to that rhetorical context, to throw out, that word there. But it can be helpful, it can be harmful, but more times than not, those aids in PowerPoint are helpful.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And so we talked about when to use a PowerPoint or Keynote type tool. And then you've also done some teaching on some potential uses of PowerPoint, sort of beyond the traditional, hey, I'm going to do a presentation. Here's a slide. Here's another slide. Can you share some of those?
Well, the one that immediately leaps to mind is kind of the most far out one, isn't necessarily a practical one, but the kind of neat, almost artistic experimental work people are doing with like PowerPoint and movies, like trying to make little short films or cartoons just using PowerPoint as a device. And those kind of things are about stretching the boundaries of what is typically considered a presentation software and what it can be. So the part of me that just likes kind of tracking emerging ways to create art is fascinated by that. And a lot of other use cases in PowerPoint get neater the further away you drift almost from the conventional sales presentation. Like, for example, I mean, everybody's seen a presentation at a wedding, for example, where it's a slideshow of the people that are, as they've grown up and met and
butterfly kissing.
Play something soft and manipulative from easy listening stations. And but the thing is, a lot of PowerPoint is, I think, splintering off into little subgenres like that, where you've got PowerPoint that is something like a family togetherness aid, if that's an awkward way to phrase it, but it's PowerPoint is serving a social function more than a persuasive or professional function there. And the thing that I'm also kind of interested in, some of my background is in literature and creative writing before I got into studying professional communication, and we would study different forms of poetry and like formal poetry, like sonnets and things like that. And there's a style of PowerPoint now that's kind of emerges. Is it Pechakucha? Is that how you pronounce it?
Pechakucha.
Well, mangled that one.
I don't even know if I'm saying
right.
It's right.
It's like
it's one of those words that
I remember that. It's like the old Muppet thing, like the Pechakucha.
I don't even know.
I think that's how I've heard it pronounced. But in any event, it's a very kind of regimented way of doing PowerPoint, where it's something like 20 slides,
20 seconds each.
At 20 seconds.
Oh, like a Ignite or a fire or lightning round. I've heard them call that at events.
Constraints. So it's about what people can do with their material within those constraints. And when I first heard about that, I was like, well, that's just adding artifice. But all art is essentially going to be artifice to some extent. There's going to be constraints in there, just like you would have a sonnet of iambic pentameter and 14 lines and all the other limitations. So I think it's fascinating to see little things like that with PowerPoint kind of emerging organically as people start kind of putting in this new formal structure to it.
I think the Pechakucha was started by architects.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, architecture.
They wanted to showcase their designs without talking about them profusely.
That's really interesting.
That's
I also
helpful.
think about architecture and that struggle between form and function.
Yeah.
And it seems like the Pechakucha is kind of about that tension.
Yeah.
To a large extent.
Well, and so now when you spoke about a family or a togetherness aid, I don't know if I'm familiar with this usage. Can you unpack that a bit?
Okay.
Is it just for the two of you, or is it for other people?
PowerPoint has brought us together.
PowerPoint at weddings and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's what you meant. Okay, I'm following.
And funerals.
A lot of I've seen that too. Where people will make at a wake, for example, a little presentation about significant moments in a person's life. And I think that those kinds of situations are hard for most people. It's hard to be articulate. It's hard to say everything you want to say. And so people turn to things like PowerPoint as a means of
coping.
Yeah, as a means
like a script for the moment.
And as a means of kind of honoring and having a shared experience where everyone watches the same slides and it triggers the same kinds of memories. And it's a way of having a more insulated, safer way of grappling with the emotions of those kind of big things.
Okay. I like it. All right. So thank you. Well, so now let's dig into maybe some of the core principles and concepts when it comes to...
Oh, I want to go back a little bit.
Okay.
Talked about some of the uses of PowerPoint that people don't know. I want to go back to this video thing. He mentioned movies. Well, social media video is like king in social media right now, but a lot of people just don't have the budget for a film crew or for like just hiring people to develop videos. You can develop right now 4K resolution videos right from PowerPoint. And with the animation techniques that you can create in PowerPoint very simply through transitions like the morph transition. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. Available with the Office 365 subscription, using that morph transition, animating between slides to move objects around and just to animate. It's so fast. I've got a video on that on YouTube right now, just how to use that morph transition. Walks you through it. But it's so easy, and you can create really, really nice looking videos and export them right as an MP4. And you can follow the video specs for Twitter, for things like Snapchat. Just create the dimensions of your slide to those output specs and create your social media campaign right from within PowerPoint. So that is a very simple use case that a lot of people haven't thought of. And with social media, it changes so rapidly. You have to be able to produce content so quickly. And having that dedicated film crew to use those fancier production tools, like the rapid fire there, the ROI necessarily isn't that right there. But with PowerPoint, it is. You can create it quickly, cheaply, and have just about anyone produce it for those social media channels.
That is cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, so now I want to talk a bit about some of the principles and conceptual pillars associated with what makes a slide great. And so, Heather, you sort of lay out a number of core principles to start with, right? With regard to thinking through this even before we get into a given slide. What are those?
Well, the course I have on Lynda, I kind of lay it out based on 3 pillars. And for that, it's kind of the audience, the environment, and like the message or like the content that you're trying to deliver for your audience. And like that, I just sort of define as pillars. But, all of that is based on, well, really classic rhetoric. But when you're thinking of your slide, a lot of people just sort of think about the message and how it relates in PowerPoint. And that's as far as it goes for a lot of people. They sometimes forget about the audience, or maybe they'll think about the audience a little bit and the message a little bit, but completely forget about the environment or where the presentation will be held or presented. And that can have a huge impact on the look of the slides or how the slides are perceived. Where you're presenting, such as a huge auditorium with thousands and thousands of people, where that message will be projected on giant screens versus a small, tiny boardroom with just 20 people. Or if that PowerPoint's going to be opened on a mobile device and just read by the CEO of the company very quickly in his car on the way to the airport, that's all going to have a huge impact on how that message will be read and perceived. And a lot of people neglect to kind of think about that when designing their slides in terms of, the font choices, even the colors or the space or layout of information on that slide. And that all plays a part.
Oh, that's so excellent. As well as I'm thinking in terms of, will there be printouts available to folks?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And then what's Nick Morgan's favorite pet peeve is I know you can't read this, but...
Yeah.
And I encounter that environment limitation quite a lot.
All the time.
Because I teach at a university, but I don't teach in the same room every term. And I've had rooms before where they're really deep rooms and they go 7-8 rows back, and others that are more shotgun style rooms where it's 3 tables or 3 rows with a bunch of lengthy tables. And so I've had times before where I've had a kind of slide deck that I would have as a go-to deck for a lecture that I deliver every term. And I've had to modify it just because it's going to be interfering with the environment. And sometimes you really can't predict or control environments. Going to conferences is a big point of stress for me,
Oh, gosh,
partly because you never know what the room is going to be like.
And a lot of times they give you a conference template that some designer created, not knowing what the environment's going to be like. They book the rooms after they create the template, or the template designers have no idea anything about the specs of the conference itself. And it's just,
My favorite story about how environment can gum up the works came when I was actually sitting in a presentation. We have department meetings on a pretty regular basis for one thing or another. And there was one time I was at a department meeting where someone was giving a presentation, and it was a session that also had lunch accompanying it. So I happened to be sitting in the back row, or kind of where they were going to be setting up the lunch buffet, catering was. And it was a lunch food tray that had this really kind of potent smelling ham that was behind me during the entire presentation. So I'm sitting here. I was an ideal audience member at that point. I was there by choice. I was actively interested. I was taking notes. Like, there was no need to convince me of anything. And I'm sitting here really trying to listen. And all I can think is, wow, it smells like ham in here. and not like good Thanksgiving ham. Like, just
slimy.
Yeah, like a little bit of viscosity to the ham.
Yeah.
I steal example when I teach, by the way.
Well, and I've seen a great speaker when they realize the wafting scent of the food is there. They'll sort of time out, check with the organizer. Can they just eat this now? And then I'll talk after that, because they just know there's no hope.
That goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right.
If your participants are in the room thinking about food, especially when the lunch tray is delivered, like, why would you keep talking? Food comes before anything else.
Totally. Well, and Alan, I really want to follow up on what you said with regard to if it's a deep versus a shallow room, you adjust the slides. Can you sort of share what sorts of adjustments do you make within those environmental context shifts?
Well, if it's a deep room versus a shallow room, the first thing I have to adjust is the size of any text that's on the screen. The kind of resolution that a slide can support, the further back people get, the harder it's going to be to be able to track what's on the slide. And so in those cases, if I would have a lecture, for example, that has kind of an anchor slide at the end, that's here are the 5 most important things to take away from the class period, like kind of slide. In a conventional classroom, I might make those, just a kind of standard top-down bullet point, which I think that is a use case where it's an appropriate, design choice. But if it's a deeper room where I think it's not going to be able to support the font for that, then maybe you break that across 5 different slides and have one point isolated on each slide in a way that the deeper room, even the people in the back, are going to be able to hear it and use it.
Yeah, white space between graphic elements is also important in those larger room environments too. Like, just to separate elements that don't go together.
Yeah.
Because, from far away, anything that looks close together looks like it goes together. So they look like one and the same, or they should be one and the same. But the more space you place between graphic elements, they look more like separate ideas or separate elements.
Okay, cool. Well, that's a great example then of how, with a shift in environment, you adjust what you're doing in the PowerPoint. Could you also give us an example within the realm of audience versus message? So like if it's like, hey, if an audience is more like this sort of audience, do this, versus if they're the opposite, do that. And likewise with message.
This is a complicated question because it starts moving outside of PowerPoint as just a software platform and into PowerPoint as kind of a presentation practice. Take it back a little bit further from that, just thinking critically about the kind of audience you're going to be talking to and what their needs are going to be. When I'm teaching, for example, to students, a lot of what we need to do is just make sure that students would understand the concepts that are being presented. So in that case, it's mostly an informative presentation. And that's different than something like a sales presentation where you might have some content, but it's about motivating somebody to a kind of action.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you want them to, go to a website or consider an idea versus just trying to get them to understand the kind of nuts and bolts behind a concept.
That's a good point. For a class situation, there's objectives. There's a group of information, like material, that as a whole, you're hoping that they'll take away, not necessarily remember all at once as soon as it comes out of your mouth, but you're hoping that they'll come back to the lecture materials and then study it on their own and at least remember the concepts to go back to either the textbook, the PowerPoint slides themselves, and basically to further study on their own. Because basically your lecture and any PowerPoint slides you provide them are there to hopefully be as a study aid. So for further learning, that's ideal, right?
Yeah.
In theory. But in a professional context, and now I'm thinking of Dr. Carmen Simon's book here.
Impossible to ignore.
Impossible to ignore. So for that one, in that context, you're wanting to pick out the most important details that your audience wants to remember and turn it into, again, that action item. And so for there, the goal is a very singular point and not a collection of points.
Well, I'm thinking about occasions where the content of what you're presenting doesn't change very much, but the audience does, and the kind of things you would do to customize. Some of the most impactful presentations that I've seen, and I'm almost going all the way back to driver's ed, where there were presentations about drinking and driving and why you shouldn't do it. And there were these very kind of emotionally hinged presentations with a lot of clear attempts to demonstrate the possible stakes behind drinking and driving. And that's very different than something that would be given on the same topic to a group of legal professionals about trying to defend and identify a legal standard of what classifies as driving under the influence, and if so, ways to defend or try to prosecute people in those kinds of contexts. Those are heavily logically driven, and you could pull in the same statistics about the impact that drinking and driving can have, high frequency among users in a young demographic, consequences. But in one case, it's a larger objective of convincing people not to do it. And in another case, it's a question of, here's how to handle it if you've got a client who's been convicted of drinking and driving. And that's very different from, somebody where the same information might be, but for an officer who has a job where they've identified someone as possibly driving under the influence, and how to kind of identify or deal with people in those kinds of situations.
And so then from a slide perspective, what do you envision as being some key things you would do differently in that logical argument versus the emotional power persuasion?
Well, this is all strictly back of the envelope here.
Sure.
Well, for the driver's ed class, it would be emotionally driven graphics. So visuals would be very key there. Full color, large.
It's like the whole slide, there's a tragic human being in blood and death.
Yeah, and
I don't think you even need to get graphic.
You don't even need to get horribly graphic, just suggestive.
Although that is an interesting kind of secondary consideration.
Yeah.
Is how
graphic do you
how
get?
Graphic would be appropriate. But you think about any kind of visual, particularly like a pictorial visual, is going to be, in many cases, emotionally powerful.
Yeah.
It's something that's meant to have a pathos appeal versus a logos appeal. And the kind of thing that isn't going to be effective, at least with the kind of younger demographic I'm sitting through driver's ed because I have to do it to get my license and I'd much rather be out, doing other stuff kind of environment. You're not going to get a lot of time to draw an audience in to the most important things you have to say. And so the easiest thing to kind of express there is not the kind of statistical ratios, it's the emotional impact.
Yeah.
And choosing visuals would be a short way to do that.
And consequences.
Yeah, consequences. And I'm also thinking about shorter text, less reliance on developing kind of a logical argument, even though there's obviously going to be kind of an implicit logic behind that, why you shouldn't drink and drive. But those are the kind of things that would jump out at me first.
Then for the legal situation, it's going to be a more logical argument. So for there. It's lawyers, they do a lot of reading.
Yeah, it's going to be able to support like your quotes, higher reliance on the speaker versus the impact of the slides themselves, because there's generally going to be a little bit more audience buy-in where you're going to be able to tolerate a little bit of more of a kind of patient delineation.
Quite frankly, I don't envision that talk necessarily being delivered as a talk. I imagine that PowerPoint file being handed off to someone and scanned as they're going from one place to another. So that's more of like what we'd call like a walking deck or an info deck, or
yeah, I use the term archival
slide deck. Whatever term you choose to use for it, but that PowerPoint deck probably won't be projected anywhere and presented in a traditional sense. It'll be read. So that one I think would be designed actually like more like a document than a docu-slide. I think that's Duarte's term. I don't remember what.
I've heard docu-slide. I've heard slideument.
Slideument. Yeah. People come up with all kinds of fun words. It's not like a presentation in the traditional sense, but it's more like a document. So like that's kind of what I envision for like the lawyer audience in the end. For the third audience, that's the cop. No PowerPoint.
Yeah.
That's all demo. That's upfront personal demo, no slides.
Perfect. Thank you. Also now, boy, we're having so much fun, but I wanted to make sure that we could touch upon a few of the key design principles that show up in slides.
Which one do you want to talk about?
Let's hit hierarchy.
Okay. For me, hierarchy is about identifying what the most important element of the slide is, and then making a visual design that is about supporting that main idea. I have a slide in one of my courses where it's about how students perceive a presentation and how long they're willing to listen. And the slide there is a kind of not a forced perspective shot, but there's a student in the foreground who's kind of turned around, and then in the background, farther off in the distance, there's a kind of blurred out version of a chalkboard or a whiteboard. So you can kind of see that it's there, but it's clearly secondary to the student themselves. Because that design, that particular slide, is not about what the presentation is. It's about how students are going to respond to presentations. So that gets the visual focus.
Gotcha.
And I think that my favorite story on that, my first day of graduate school, my instructor was an old Southern lady. And she walked in and said, "This is the most important thing I'm going to tell y'all about writing." And then on the board, she wrote down "serve the whole." And what that meant was that in any kind of story or point of communication, you identify what's the most important thing I want to say, and then design secondary choices around furthering that important thing. But the reason I've always remembered it is because she had really bad penmanship, and she kind of wrote it on the board without reading it out loud.
With this really curlicue Southern scrawl.
Yeah. And so it looked like "serve the whale." And so I'm looking at it and I'm going, "Serve the whale?"
And
What
she never actually said "serve the whole." So he's like,
she just stepped back and had people read it and ponder it. And I'm like, "Serve the whale? Like, what does it mean?" But once I kind of caught on after a couple minutes, like, "Oh, this is serve the whole. Well, maybe graduate school is not hard." Okay. Then I think it's a really important kind of anchor concept, because hierarchy is about identifying what's most important. And I just talked about that in a visual way, but it also happens with things like the size of text. Larger text is perceived as more important than smaller text. Big visuals are perceived as dominant to captions, and those kinds of things.
And for the structure of the presentation as a whole, like, you can have a hierarchy throughout the entire slide deck. What slides in the presentation stand out? You know how PowerPoint, you've got that slide sorter view where you can zoom out and see all your slides, from kind of like this bird's eye view. What slides stand out? What's the hierarchy there from that view? What 5 slides out of that, 100 slides that you have in that presentation, if you have that many, stand out? Because those 5 slides out of that 100, those are going to be the ones that, in theory, will gain or garner that attention if they do stand out visually. So there's a hierarchy to the individual slides, the slide deck together, and then from like a content standpoint as well. So you're creating kind of a visual hierarchy and, even a content hierarchy. But yeah.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Well, tell me, Heather and Alan, is there anything else that you want to make sure to mention right up front before we hear about a couple of your favorite things?
For me, the most common question that I get is about text on a slide and how much text should be on there.
Yeah.
And how it should be used. And I think that question kind of comes from misunderstanding how PowerPoint is designed to operate. Or it's not a text-based medium. At heart, it's a visual medium that uses text elements. And I think that then, in terms of my own kind of professional development that I've led, that's one of the ideas that really seems to resonate with people, is thinking of PowerPoint not just as something that contains your script, but as something that is meant to contain visuals that enhance the presentation itself, and considering text as just one of those kind of fundamentally visual elements.
See, for me, when people ask me how much text is allowed on the slide, how much should I use, should I avoid it, or even when you get to the bullet point question, can I use bullet points or bullet points okay? I really don't like answering those questions because I just don't feel that that's the right question you should be asking. Because again, for me, it comes down to the audience, their expectations, the content, the environment, and what's appropriate to use for that presentation in that moment, in that time. And there's a lot of ifs there. And if your audience is expecting text, if they're hoping for text, like those students in the classroom that plan on using those PowerPoint files to help them study, they expect text. They want text. Right. And, it may not be the best visual. It may not be the most engaging, but they want some kind of text document that they can quickly search, quickly scan, and use it to help them study. You may not use that as, your lecture slides, but they want something.
Perfect. Thank you.
And that kind of goes back to the initial comment that I made when starting this podcast, which is about who the slide deck is designed to benefit. And that's, if it's a deck that is often designed to help the speaker, it ends up kind of overburdened with text. And if it's designed to help the audience or the students, then text can be moderated appropriately.
Very good. Thank you. Well, now could you share with us a favorite book, something that you found helpful?
Oh, gosh. Well, my favorite design book, we've been talking about hierarchy, space, color, all these like different, design elements. My favorite design book primer, if anyone's listening and wants to learn more about graphic design, great primer is by Alex W. White, The Elements of Graphic Design. And I strongly recommend getting the hard copy physical book as opposed to the Kindle edition because the pages are beautiful. So that's a great one. There's a lot of other graphic design books out there that talk about the same kind of visual design elements and graphic design elements. But I like Alex White. It's like a quick read, enjoyable read, lots of pretty pictures. So
cool.
And if I'm picking one that I think has a nice kind of general audience appeal, it would be Nancy Duarte's Slidology. And I like Slidology mostly because it's got a very academic foundation to it, but it's not in any way inaccessible. Mm-hmm. It's very kind of grounded in best practices, and it's also very actionable. Like there's a lot of little exercises and suggestions about how to create a good deck, in addition to understanding what a good slide deck might look like in a moment.
And of course, Dr. Carmen Simon's book, Impossible to Ignore. We mentioned that one earlier. She's been on your show.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So yeah, love her book.
Well, thank you. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch with you two, where would you point them?
I have a website at Heather Ackmann. That's Ackmann with 2 N's, ACKMANN .com. And I also have a YouTube channel, same thing, youtube.com/Heather Ackmann.
The easiest way to actually probably get a hold of me is through DePaul University, where I teach there. And my email address is very accessible. Just go to DePaul's directory, and I'm really easy to find.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, Alan, Heather, thank you so much for sharing this stuff. It sounds like we have much more to dig into, and I appreciate it. And I wish you tons of luck in rocking and rolling tremendous presentations and experiences in the weeks and years ahead.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us on.
I really appreciated Alan and Heather's perspective there on the emotional versus the rational, logical stuff and how you can really serve yourself well and serve your audience well to have a good, clear think about what's the most appropriate avenue by which you are trying to be persuasive and communicate, and then to make your slides fit that accordingly. So I think sometimes it's natural to just sort of default to the mode that you're always in. Well, we're always trying to prove out business cases, so logical, rational, of course. But maybe it's time to zag and go in the other direction and make it all the more noteworthy and impressive when you do so. So if you'd like to check out the show notes, the transcripts, the links to items we've referenced, it's over at awesomeatyourjob.com/ep261. If you haven't already, I hope you'll push subscribe to hear from folks like our next guest. It is Carter Cast. He is a professor over at Kellogg Business School, also the Chicago area, Evanston, over at Northwestern there. And he's talking about careers that derail. What's up with that? How does that happen? And how could you prevent it from happening to you? Hope to catch you there. And peace.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. To get the most out of this conversation, visit awesomeatyourjob.com to find today's show notes, transcript, and infographic summary cheat sheet. For more entertaining professional skill sharpening, be sure to subscribe to catch the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.
One, two, three, four. Those are numbers. But you already knew that. If you want to know what number you're going to pay each month for your car, use Kelley Blue Book My Wallet on AutoTrader. They're really good at numbers. AutoTrader.